when a bride ran past shocked guests to embrace a homeless man outside her wedding. Whispers of confusion filled the church. No one knew who he was or why 12 U.S. Marines marched in minutes later and saluted her. What began as a quiet act of kindness in San Diego, a pastry left on a park bench each morning, unfolded into a breathtaking revelation that would change lives and shatter assumptions. This is the unforgettable story of Emily Sanchez, a woman who didn't seek recognition, yet unknowingly honored a forgotten hero, and built a legacy of compassion that reached far beyond her bakery door. Now, let's begin. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. "Don't tell me you actually invited him to the wedding?" one guest whispered, scandalized as the bride rushed past rows of polished shoes and designer heels to hug a homeless man seated quietly near the back of the church. Some guests turned away in discomfort, avoiding eye contact. The moment hung in the air like an unexpected pause in a love song. But then, the doors of the church creaked open again, and 12 United States Marines entered, dressed in formal uniforms, boots synchronized, their chests gleaming with service ribbons. They marched in perfect formation and saluted the bride in unison. A hush fell over the crowd. Earlier that morning, Emily Sanchez had begun her day the way she had for the past 6 years, long before any wedding bells rang. At 4:30 a.m. she was already at Sunrise Bakery in San Diego, sleeves rolled up, the scent of warm butter and cinnamon floating in the air. At 30 years old, Emily wasn't just known for her legendary croissants and gooey cinnamon rolls. She was known for something far more tender. Each morning, after finishing her first batch of pastries, Emily would quietly wrap one in parchment, pour a steaming cup of coffee into a to-go cup, and slip out the back door. She placed the breakfast on a weathered bench by the bus stop, always with a handwritten note, "Have a peaceful day." The recipient, an elderly man in a tattered coat who never begged, never approached customers, just sat in silence waiting for the dawn. For 6 years, she never asked his name, and he never offered it. Their exchange was wordless, just soft nods, fleeting eye contact, and quiet ritual. Her co-workers often mocked her behind her back. "That's a waste of good product," some would say. Others rolled their eyes, predicting, "He's going to take advantage of her one day." 3 months ago, a new manager took over the bakery. During Emily's annual performance review, he hesitated before saying, "Your philanthropic gestures are admirable, but some customers feel uneasy. Maybe you could donate to a shelter instead." Emily smiled politely, nodded, but changed nothing. She simply arrived 15 minutes earlier each day, leaving the food before anyone else noticed. But the world does notice eventually. Just last month, a new employee spotted her returning from her early morning drop-off. Word spread quickly. One customer, loud enough for Emily to hear, scoffed, "Poor girl, thinks she's making a difference." Emily didn't flinch. She continued kneading dough, her hands steady. But inside it stung. Not because she needed validation, but because they couldn't see what she saw. People aren't problems to be solved. They're stories waiting to be heard. "You're too soft-hearted," her mother had said when Emily got engaged to Marco, a firefighter with the same quiet compassion. He'd hand out blankets during night calls, helped strangers with stalled cars, and once anonymously paid a family's heating bill. Marco understood Emily's morning ritual without needing an explanation. Giving, they both believed, wasn't about applause. It was about choosing to see the invisible, those whom the world passed by without a second glance. Emily and the old man had never spoken, but one rainy December morning she noticed him trembling in the cold. Without a second thought, she added her old wool scarf to the usual breakfast package. The next day, folded in the napkin, was a note in shaky pencil. "Thank you for seeing me as a human being." She kept the note in her purse ever since, pulling it out on days when the world felt especially hard-edged and unkind. As her wedding approached, Emily placed a large cake order with Sunrise Bakery and invited all her co-workers to the ceremony. Marco, ever the joker, teased her, You're inviting the whole neighborhood, aren't you?" She only smiled. That was part of why he loved her. The day before the wedding, an unsigned envelope arrived at the venue. On the front it simply read, "For the bride." Inside was a card with heartfelt wishes and one cryptic line. "Tomorrow, I come not to buy pastries, but to repay a debt." There was no name, no return address. Emily read the handwriting again and again. It stirred something familiar, something just beyond memory. On the morning of the wedding, as sunlight streamed through the church windows, Emily peeked out from the bridal suite. Guests were arriving, family, friends, co-workers, all dressed in their best. Her heart pounded, nerves dancing in her chest. And then she saw him, the man from the bench. Hair combed, coat patched, shoes shined, he stood awkwardly near the back pews, eyes darting toward the floor. Emily didn't hesitate. She lifted her gown and ran, past shocked faces, past the whispers, straight into the arms of the man she'd never truly met, but always known. And behind him, 12 Marines in full dress uniform entered the church, standing tall. One of them stepped forward and saluted her. "For 6 years," he said, "you fed our former sergeant. When the world forgot him, you remembered. He asked us to come today, not for him, but for you." Gasps filled the church. Some guests wept. Emily stood frozen, holding back tears. No one whispered anymore, because in that moment it was crystal clear kindness may go unnoticed for a while, but one day it stands up in uniform and salutes you in front of the world. Somewhat embarrassed, Emily peeked out from the bridal suite and spotted him, the old man from the bus stop, but today he looked different. Though his suit was clearly worn, it had been carefully ironed. His scuffed shoes had been polished to a soft gleam. His gray hair was combed neatly, and for the first time she could see his face without the filter of morning fog or shadows. It bore the marks of time and hardship, but it held a quiet dignity, a solemn pride that made her breath catch. The murmurs had already begun. Whispers floated in through the open door. "Who invited the homeless guy?" one woman scoffed. "You've got to be kidding me. She actually invited him?" Another added, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Is he here to ask for help during a wedding?" Emily's heart dropped. All the meticulous planning, the color palettes, the floral arrangements, the choreography of the bridal entrance vanished from her mind. Without hesitation, she grabbed the hem of her white gown and rushed past the startled faces of guests and the panicked shouts of the wedding planner. Her veil trailed behind her like a comet's tail as she ran through the marble-floored lobby of the church. She reached him, arms flung wide, and wrapped him in an embrace so full of warmth it brought tears to her eyes. Her makeup began to dissolve in streaks, but she didn't care. "I still remember your eyes," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That first morning, back in 2017, the man Victor smiled, a deep, weathered, honest smile that softened the angles of his face. "And I remember every morning you treated me like a human being," he replied, his voice stronger and clearer than she'd ever imagined it would be. Emily looped her arm through his, ready to walk him inside with the same grace and certainty she'd once served him breakfast. But before they could take a step, the wedding planner rushed up, visibly flustered. "Emily, we're about to begin the ceremony. Who is this gentleman?" Before she could answer, a sudden change in the air silenced the church. Outside, the rumble of traffic seemed to still, replaced by the sound of synchronized footsteps. The grand double doors of the church burst open. 12 U.S. Marines in full dress blues stepped inside in perfect formation. Their polished boots struck the stone floor with commanding precision. White gloves, chiseled faces, perfect alignment. They looked like something from a military parade. The room froze. Even the clink of a dropped champagne flute shattered into the silence like thunder. Leading them was a Marine captain with the nameplate Duncan. He stepped forward, every movement crisp and intentional, and executed a sharp salute before Emily. "On behalf of Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," he announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "We are here to honor the woman who silently saved a hero Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily turned to Victor, her hand still wrapped around his arm, confusion and awe swirling in her expression. Captain Duncan continued, now gesturing toward the older man beside her. "This is Sergeant Victor Hale," he declared. "A Marine who saved 9 lives during an ambush in Fallujah in 2004. After losing his wife and daughter in a tragic car accident in 2016, he withdrew from society, never claiming military benefits, never revealing his identity. The church, once filled with chatter and judgments, was now silent. Faces turned pale. Some guests who had whispered cruelly just moments earlier now stood rooted in shame. A younger Marine stepped forward and handed Emily a metal box along with an old, weather-worn photograph. It showed a younger Victor Hale in combat, carrying a bloodied fellow Marine across a war-torn street. In the background stood a thinner, barely recognizable version of Captain Duncan. "He carried me 4 blocks under enemy fire after I was hit by shrapnel in both legs," Duncan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He came back for 8 more men that day. Though wounded himself, he refused to stop. His actions earned him a Silver Star, an honor he never claimed." Captain Duncan paused, his gaze steady on Emily. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. And if it weren't for you, Ms. Sanchez, he might not have survived long enough to be recognized." Tears streamed down Emily's face. She turned to Victor, her heart pounding with realization. "I never knew," she whispered. Victor's voice was low but steady. "That's the thing I didn't want to be known. After I lost my family, I couldn't live with people calling me a hero, when I couldn't even save the ones I loved." His voice cracked slightly. "But you never asked who I was. You just fed me, looked me in the eyes, and left me messages that gave me something to live for." The Marines now stood in 2 straight lines, forming an aisle of honor that stretched from the church doors to the altar. Captain Duncan turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with solemn reverence, "you've just witnessed the quietest act of valor I've ever known, not on a battlefield, but on a sidewalk, with a cup of coffee and a pastry." And with that, the bride and the sergeant walked down the aisle together, past the stunned guests, past the golden sunlight pouring through the stained glass, 2 quiet heroes now seen. Mrs. Sanchez never knew she was feeding a decorated war hero. To her he was simply a man, one of many, weathering life's storms in silence. Day after day, year after year, she gave without expecting thanks, recognition, or return. But now, standing in the church, the truth unfurled like a flag in the wind. Victor's eyes scanned the pews, resting briefly on those who had whispered judgment just moments before. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. "In the Marines," Captain Duncan said, stepping forward once more, "we have a saying, never leave a man behind. Miss Emily Sanchez, though she's never worn a uniform, has lived that principle better than many who have." From the side, one of the bridesmaids stepped forward, tears glistening on her cheeks. "I work with Emily at the bakery," she said. "She used to come in early, pay for extra ingredients herself, just to make sure he had something warm to eat." Another co-worker rose, his voice tinged with regret. "We made fun of her," he admitted. "We said she was wasting her time. We didn't see what she saw." A guest near the back, overcome with emotion, stood abruptly. "We thought we were attending a wedding," he said, "but we're witnessing a ceremony of honor." Victor turned to Emily, gripping her hands gently. "Today," he said, "I have nothing to give but the truth, my presence and my gratitude. I overheard you once tell a customer there wouldn't be a big wedding gift, so I made a few calls." He smiled faintly. "I hope you don't mind." Emily laughed through her tears. "This is the most beautiful gift I could ever imagine." Marco, who had been quietly absorbing every moment, stepped forward now. Still in awe, he extended his hand to Victor. "Sir, it would be our honor if you'd walk Emily down the aisle." Sometimes, life gives back in ways you never expect. After their honeymoon, Emily didn't return to the bakery. Instead, she and Marco used their wedding funds to start a non-profit breakfast program for homeless veterans. They named it Quiet Tables, a place where no one had to explain themselves to receive a warm meal. There were no press releases, no viral campaigns, just a wooden sign carved with simple words: to feed a person is to feed a life that might otherwise be forgotten. Victor Hale never returned to Quiet Tables, but every month Emily received a postcard, postmarked from cities across the country, always with the same message: every breakfast is a greeting. Thank you, Emily. Captain Duncan later explained that Victor finally accepted assistance from the VA. With help from his fellow Marines, he got medical care, trauma counseling, and a home. He even reconnected with a military community he had once walked away from. On their first wedding anniversary, Emily and Marco arrived at Quiet Tables to find 12 Marines waiting in plain clothes, each holding a flower. "We're taking shifts," Duncan said with a warm smile. "We won't let this honor fade." What began as a quiet act of daily kindness had grown into something far greater. Veterans across San Diego knew about the little outdoor cafe with no price list and no questions, a place where you were seen, not scanned, where you were human, not homeless. Emily framed Victor's original napkin note and hung it above the counter. "Thank you for seeing me as a human being." Below it, she added her own words: "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." 6 months later, a local film crew discovered Quiet Tables and requested an interview. Emily declined. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about remembering the invisible people among us." On hard mornings, when supplies were low or volunteers didn't show, Emily would remember that day. The way 12 Marines had walked into her wedding like a military honor guard, standing tall for something most would never even notice. That was all the motivation she needed to keep going. Marco understood. As a firefighter, he knew that heroism wasn't always a dramatic rescue from a burning building. Sometimes it looked like a warm meal handed out in silence, again and again, without thanks. "You know," he said one evening as they reset tables in the early dawn light, "when I married you, I didn't just get a wife, I gained 12 Marines and an entire family of veterans." Emily smiled. "The best kind of family," she said. "The kind you choose, and choose again." She believed, deeply, that small meals could save great souls. That some heroes don't need medals, they just need to be treated like people. Because some debts aren't paid with money, they're paid with dignity. She never needed to know Victor Hale's name to offer him compassion. She had only seen the tired eyes, the hungry silence, the humanity waiting beneath the worn coat. And in doing so, she reminded an entire military unit and an entire city that not every protector wears a uniform in plain sight. Some heroes sleep beneath awnings. Some veterans sit on benches by bus stops. Some people who saved lives, once teachers, nurses, soldiers, fade into the background of our hurried days. But they're still there, still worthy, still human. Live kindly, not for the applause, but because one day, maybe when you least expect it, 12 people might walk through a door and bow their heads for something you never thought anyone would celebrate. In a world obsessed with viral fame and grand gestures, let us remember, true heroism often lives in the smallest, quietest acts of compassion, performed without an audience, but never without impact. And in the days that followed, long after the last tables had been cleared and the final dish washed, Emily found herself standing alone beneath the sign at Quiet Tables. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the engraved message stared back at her like an unblinking truth. To feed a person is to feed a life that might otherwise be forgotten. She traced her fingers over the letters, remembering each morning she had slipped a pastry and a note beside a man she didn't know. Back then, she didn't think of it as noble. She simply thought of it as necessary. And perhaps that's the first truth worth remembering in this story. Kindness isn't always a performance. Sometimes it's a quiet instinct, uncelebrated, like a habit the soul develops over time. Emily had no idea she was feeding a war hero. She simply saw a human being the rest of the world had stopped seeing, and that was enough. But now, that single gesture had rippled outward like a stone tossed into a still pond. The Marines, the postcards, the line of volunteers who showed up week after week. It was as though compassion had taken root, and from it a whole community had bloomed. What she did wasn't loud. It wasn't branded or broadcasted, and yet it moved people. It reminded them that beneath every tattered coat, behind every tired eye, there was once a dream, a duty, a childhood, a fight survived. That's what Victor Hale had become, a mirror. His story forced people to face their own indifference, to ask hard questions about who we walk past each day without truly seeing. Emily hadn't asked him to justify his presence. She hadn't asked for credentials or backstory or proof of worth. She had simply given. And in doing so, she gave him the one thing he'd lost when his family died, the sense that he mattered. And that's the lesson too few of us carry. Sometimes people don't need your pity or your rescue. They need your presence. They need to be acknowledged, fed, greeted, welcomed back into the story of the world. In the months that followed the wedding, quiet tables grew, not just in size but in spirit. What began as a modest corner under an awning behind the bakery became a sanctuary, not a soup kitchen, not a charity line, a table. That word mattered. Tables meant conversation. Tables meant dignity. Tables meant dignity. Tables meant you belong. They printed name cards, not for show, but to remind guests that they weren't forgotten. Marco built a rack where people could hang jackets during cold mornings, each one tagged, "Take one, return if you can, no questions asked." A former Marine named Lewis started offering free haircuts once a month. A retired school teacher came by with books and crossword puzzles. It became a village of restoration, built not on pity, but on shared humanity. Emily never called herself a founder. She was just Em, the woman with the cinnamon rolls and the scarf tied around her ponytail. She never gave speeches. She simply served. And that service began to inspire others. A teenager, whose father was deployed overseas, asked if he could bring his guitar and play for the guests. A bakery competitor across town began sending surplus muffins every Wednesday. A coffee shop nearby offered free thermoses on cold days. Quiet tables didn't just restore stomachs, it restored dignity. People came for food and stayed for conversation, for eye contact, for the sense of being remembered. Ellis patted the elderly. But why did this story matter? Why had it touched so many? Because we live in a time that often mistakes noise for impact, fame for legacy. In a culture of viral videos and overnight celebrities, the idea that a woman quietly fed a man for 6 years with no audience and no agenda feels almost revolutionary. And yet, that's where real change happens. Not on stages, but on sidewalks and doorways, at worn-out benches under bus stop awnings. This story reminds us that goodness isn't always visible, but it is always powerful. That recognition is not the purpose of kindness. It's merely the byproduct. What Emily did, what people like her do every day, often goes unnoticed. But that doesn't make it any less sacred. There's something achingly beautiful about choosing to do good when no one is watching, about giving a meal that may never be thanked, about investing in strangers simply because you believe in their worth, even when the world doesn't. Emily never forgot Victor Hale. He didn't return after the wedding, but his postcards kept coming, each one signed in the same way. Every breakfast is a greeting. Thanks, Emily. She didn't need more. Those words meant more than any award. And in time, Quiet Tables became more than a non-profit. It became a movement. Schools in other states began replicating the model. Churches adapted the table concept for refugee families. A nursing home opened a Veterans Hour, inspired by Emily's philosophy: sit, feed, listen. A reporter once asked her if she ever imagined that her simple act would lead to all this. She smiled and replied softly, "No, I just didn't want him to feel forgotten." One evening, as Emily and Marco were locking up, a little girl approached with her mother. The child, no older than 8, clutched a napkin with her name scribbled in purple crayon. She handed it shyly to Emily. "I want to feed people too," she said. Emily kneeled down, eyes stinging with tears, and took the note gently. That was it, that was the legacy. Not the Marines, not the wedding, not even Victor's story. It was a child learning that kindness matters, that invisible people are never truly invisible to those who choose to see. In the end, this story is not just about a bride and a soldier. It's about what happens when we remember each other, when we make room at the table for those who have been pushed aside. It's about choosing to live kindly, not for show, but because the world is full of forgotten stories, and sometimes we are the only ones who can carry them forward. It's about believing that no act of compassion is ever wasted. And if we're lucky, if we're quiet, steady, and sincere, our kindness might one day walk into a church, dressed in uniform, and remind us what true honor looks like. Because in the end, the smallest gesture can awaken the greatest truths. That dignity is not earned through status, that love is a service, not a ceremony, and that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is to feed someone who the world forgot. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard.